Welcome to Tucker Carlson. Today we had a long conversation with Roger Stone. It was so interesting we broke it into two parts. Here's the second part. Do you think if you'd made it inside the Capitol, they would have prosecuted you?
I think I was being set up. I mean, here's the amazing thing, and that is I watched the president's speech from my hotel room at the Willard Hotel, and then there was a call on the house phone, and two agents from the Secret Service wanted to escort me to the Capitol. Now, I've been in politics for a long time. The Secret Service doesn't do political chores. They never have. I would have gotten there had I left at that moment at the exact time that these folks broke into the Capitol. Now I know that my friends Alex Jones and Ali Alexander are approached by the Secret Service and asked if they want an escort to the Capitol at the same time. Had Alex Jones not stopped for a bathroom break, they would have gotten there just as the building was being penetrated. As it was, they got there afterwards, and you can see it. Jones jumps up on a chair with a bullhorn and says, "No, don't go in the building, pull back, this is a peaceful demonstration." He tried to stop it, and that's a fact.
So do you think the Secret Service was involved? Trump's Secret Service was involved?
I don't know why else they would want to escort me to the Capitol where I had already decided not to go.
Why'd you decide not to go?
I don't know. It's an excellent question. I had a feeling. I had an intuition. I just did not want to go. I think that God was giving me a signal. I didn't go. By the way, they'll make fun of that too, but that's the fact of it.
That's amazing.
It is.
I had no idea. They're still on your case, the federal government.
Well, I've just gotten a subpoena, which is very interesting. Let me be as clear as I possibly can. Any claim or assertion or implication that I either knew about or was involved in any way in the illegal activities of the Capitol on January 6th is categorically false. But if you read their subpoena, we're investigating the events that led to the illegal events of January 6th. I think they mean precede, not led to. In other words, they're trying to say that my remarks at two legally permitted rallies the day before are the cause of the break-in. CNN actually aired a part of my speech where I said that I had an apocalyptic view of our politics today over the struggle the country's facing. That yes, I think it's a struggle between dark and light, between good and evil, between the godly and the godless. And they said, well, that was the inciting of violence. No, that's a statement of my beliefs. It's First Amendment constitutionally permitted free speech. Well, you urged people to come to Washington. Yes, they had a right to assemble. It's in the Constitution. So there is
not to support Trump. That's not allowed, is it?
No, clearly not. I mean, look, there's no there. This is a classic case of guilt by association, and nobody's been worse than ABC News. Here's a picture of Roger Stone with a member of the Proud Boys. Here's a picture of Roger Stone with a member of the Oath Keepers. Do you have any idea how many pictures I've had with people whose names I don't even know over the last 2 years? I mean, I'm an American political icon, whether I like it or not. But the idea that I'm responsible for anything that person has done, past, present, or future, when I don't even know their name, is an absurdity.
ABC News has done that?
They have the absolute worst. We have groundbreaking video of Stone standing outside the front of his hotel. Well, if you watch the video, all you're going to find out is how much people love Roger Stone and how I accommodate those who ask for a selfie or a picture or a handshake or whatever. Now, in the background, you can see members of the Proud Boys. Yeah, and that proves exactly what? That proves nothing.
Why do you think, really? Who at ABC is leading this, do you think?
Well, I've been particularly disappointed in Ali Dukakis, her bylines on the story. I used to think she was a pretty fair reporter, but this is just flat out guilt by association. It's outrageous, really. And there's nothing to tell the committee. There's no documents to turn over. I know nothing whatsoever about this. But let's look at it from another point of view. One thing I'm not is politically stupid.
Yes.
Breaking into the Capitol did not politically benefit Donald Trump in any way whatsoever. In fact, it was counterproductive.
That's for sure.
Why would anyone do that? Why would anyone advocate that? We went there to try to get a brief re-examination of the vote. Ted Cruz and others were prepared to make that motion. It's part of the democratic process. I never urged anyone to attack anyone ever, anywhere, and I certainly didn't urge anybody to break in to the Capitol and trespass. On the other hand, for them to say this was the most deadly day in American history since Pearl Harbor, The only person I know that was killed as a direct result was an unarmed woman who was murdered in cold blood, and she was unarmed and threatening no one. Since when does trespassing excuse you for first-degree murder?
That's a question we've asked many times.
I've seen it.
Shot by a man with a demonstrated history of recklessness who left a loaded Glock in the men's room in the Capitol and somehow kept his job. This is Lieutenant Byrd. He should have been fired.
And goes on TV and says he's proud of what he did. Amazing.
Yeah. Shooting an unarmed woman.
Yeah.
Right.
Veteran, too.
So, you are under subpoena at this point?
They have served a subpoena. I have until December 7th to decide whether I would turn over documents. There are no documents to turn over. And I have, I believe, until December 17th to decide whether I will be questioned. But why would I go be questioned by Adam Schiff? I mean, Adam Schiff is the architect of my previous indictment. He broke House rules by talking about my testimony. Mueller shared my emails with Schiff so that he could fashion his gotcha questions. Any misstatement I made before the House Intelligence Committee was irrelevant, immaterial, hid no underlying crime. And in fact, on November 3rd, 2020, Election Day, without any question, the busiest media day of the year, at midnight, the Department of Justice puts out a press release with the last remaining long-hidden, unredacted sections of Mueller's report, in which he says there are factual hurdles in terms of connecting Stone to Russian collusion, WikiLeaks collaboration, or the phishing and publication of John Podesta's emails. In other words, they have no evidence. They could find none. And they go on to say that even if we had found such evidence, we believe it would be constitutionally protected political activity and not be illegal. So what then did I lie about? What was my motive to lie to Congress if there's no underlying act? The judge said, you've been convicted of lying to cover up for Donald Trump. Cover up what? Your own report said that there was nothing to cover up. The whole thing is a sham.
You didn't even work for Trump.
It's a sham.
So I don't want to get too down the rabbit hole, but I can't. You've just reminded me of a personal hobby horse. So you said the WikiLeaks leak of material from John Podesta's personal Gmail account and from the DNC server. Now, we were told, Adam Schiff came on the show and told me to my face that we know for a fact that material was stolen by the Russians. Do we know that?
No, actually, my trial disproves that. My lawyers moved for the CrowdStrike report, which the judge refused to give us. The government it's still classified to this day. But what we do know is that the testimony of the CrowdStrike CEO before the House Intelligence Committee.
CrowdStrike was the company brought in by the DNC to assess their service.
Right. So in my trials, the first time the FBI admits having never examined the servers. They won't give us the report, but we later learned that the CrowdStrike CEO in his testimony before the House Intelligence Committee admits that the report did not include proof that the Russians hacked the DNC. Specifically, the judge denied us the right to use either forensic evidence or expert testimony to show that the underlying premise of my indictment, the first 4 pages, say the Russians hacked the DNC and gave the information to WikiLeaks. That's the premise for my indictment. That's what I'm alleged to have lied about. I could have proved at trial that that never happened, but the judge would not allow it.
So there really isn't any evidence that the core crime that we spent years talking about even occurred. I mean, I always thought it was much more likely that a DNC employee sympathetic to Bernie Sanders was angry because the DNC circumvented democracy, screwed Bernie Sanders, and this person wanted that to be publicly known. That was always my guess.
Well, here's what there is most definitely evidence of. If you look at the download times at the time that the material was taken, they're too slow for an online hack. There was never an online hack. They were downloaded to a portable device and taken out the back door by someone.
So they were stolen from within the building.
Correct, and I could have proven that at trial, but the judge denied it because she said, we don't have to prove that Stone was working with the Russians to prove that he lied. Well, but the lies have to be material to violate the False Statements Act, and of course they don't prove anything. They prove nothing at all. On the other hand, the jury forewoman was attacking me on Facebook and Twitter in 2019, the year before I was tried, attacking me regarding the very case in which she would later be selected as a juror but she kept those posts on a private setting during jury selection, during the trial, and then she deleted them after the trial. The judge ruled that that was not evidence of bias.
So what have you learned about American politics from this odyssey you've been through?
Well, I guess the most important thing I've learned and what's changed is, for the first time ever, we have the complete control and censorship of all mass communications.
Yes.
It's not just network television, cable television, corporately owned radio. I mean, to the extent that you have conservative radio today, it's on the mom and pop or smaller owned stations. The internet, most certainly. I mean, try posting a video about Tony Fauci and see what happens to you. Yeah. It gets deleted at YouTube like that. You can't question whether he lied to Congress, which is extraordinary. You're just not allowed to even question that. And of course,
there's a federal bureaucrat who's in charge of our COVID policy, and you're not allowed to criticize him.
You can't even question him at all. So from a political point of view, it's very hard to win an election when all mass communications are controlled and censored. Now, we don't have to have a presence everywhere. The internet, having a beachhead on the internet, is more than enough. In other words, you can build a platform that is virtually impossible to deplatform if you don't use cheap plug-in software owned by Amazon or Apple or Google.
Right.
Once you have that platform, you could utilize it as a news site, you could utilize it as a web hosting site, you could utilize it as an event site, you could utilize it to build our own community. The internet is still going to be the most dominant means of communications. Just looking at Republican primary voters, because I'm obviously back to my old trade. I'm working again as a political strategist. It's amazing how many people have moved off of cable television and are getting their political news digitally. It's like 83% of the Republican primary voters in Oklahoma say they're now getting their political news on the internet, not on cable, not even on talk radio anymore.
Where are they getting it from?
I think they're getting it from sites like the Daily Caller and from Fox, parts of Fox.
Yeah.
They're getting it from OAN. They're getting it from Newsmax. They're getting it at the stonecoldtruth.com. I mean, there's any number of places you can go, and that's expanding. Right Side Broadcasting is terrific.
Yes.
Real America's Voice. I mean, there are a lot of outlets out there. In fact, I'm happy to tell you that I will be doing a show 5 days a week on Real America's Voice from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Time every day.
Wow. How is that accessible? How do you get to that?
You get to it online. I think you'll also be able to get to it on Dish. This is where Steve Bannon's War Room is. The War Room, that was the name of my show when I was on InfoWars. He kind of appropriated it. But so I'm going to see what it's like to do a daily show for an hour. I understand it's very hard work.
It's not that hard. It's fun. You get into it. So is there enough bandwidth uncensored for a Republican president to win again?
Yes, but I think from a campaign technology point of view, you're going to have to drop back to older technology. Blast emails, good old-fashioned postal direct mail, which is really how the conservative movement first grew.
For sure.
When you couldn't communicate through the media of the day, when you only had a handful of news magazines and newspapers, and only 3 networks, and all 3 of them lied, you had to develop your own method of communication. So I do think there is a way to do this. You have to drop back to somewhat older, but still extraordinarily effective technologies. The extent to which we are banned, so let's say that you are a donor of mine, you've given to the Stone Defense Fund, which is at stonedefensefund.com. By the way, I still have 6 remaining harassment lawsuits against me, baseless, groundless, unsubstantiated, but incredibly sensationalized lawsuits that I have to defend. This is called lawfare, where they file totally phony lawsuits against you, but they're tremendously sensationalized. They're meant to both grind you down with legal fees and to drag your name through the mud one more time. If you gave me a contribution and you're at Gmail, when I respond to you with a thank you or with another solicitation, it's going to go to your spam. Now, you find it in spam and you mark it as white mail. Guess what? The next time I send it to you, it's still going to spam.
Right. No. Google's totally corrupt. And in fact, someone who worked for Trump's fundraising operation in 2020 told me that in the final weeks of the campaign, Gmail stopped delivering fundraising solicitations from the Trump campaign, which seems like it would have to be illegal, but no one ever did anything about it.
I saw one congressional race where Comcast refused to deliver text messages from a particular candidate. I don't want to name any names, Laura Loomer. So, I mean, this is the use of the technology against us, I think, in an illegal way. The only way they can win is through censorship and control the message, because they cannot win a vigorous debate of ideas. They've given up trying to argue their point of view. They can't argue it. So now their response is, you must be silenced.
Can any person who dissents from the program break through?
Well, that remains to be seen. I mean, 2022 is going to tell us a great deal about 2024. If we can't have an honest election in 2022, meaning the full ability to communicate with all voters. Yeah. If we have that, then we will win. We'll win, and if the vote is honest, we'll win. But if they limit us, for example, if a Democratic congressional candidate is allowed to do paid advertising on Facebook, but his Republican opponent is not, well, first of all, I think that's a campaign finance violation. That's an FEC violation. But then that happened in the last two congressional cycles. But the people at the National Republican Congressional Committee were so busy counting money, they couldn't get around to doing anything about it.
What do you mean they didn't do anything about it?
They should have brought an FEC action immediately. That's an illegal corporate contribution. If you're allowing the Democrat to do paid advertising on Facebook, but you're not allowing his Republican to do so. Exactly. But I don't think it's ever been litigated.
Do you think that the Republican Party in Washington will ever align with its own voters?
No, actually, the Republican National Committee is it's grifter central. I mean, they raised $200 million to challenge the results of the election, and there are more than enough irregularities and anomalies to bear at least additional examination.
Yes,
which we could not even get from no court, from no legislature, from certainly not from the Congress. But they didn't spend any money on that. Then the more important question is, those at the Republican National Committee saw the Democrats going in systematically into the swing states and changing the state election laws to make fraud easier.
Yes.
And they did nothing about that. Again.
Well, how? How could you? I mean, I watched it too, but I'm not involved in politics. I'm just observing. But
well, it is either incompetence, but more likely, those at the Republican National Committee would like Donald Trump to play through as quickly as possible as well, so they can get back to their cozy little arrangements. I mean, look, I'm going to find somebody who's a major donor to the Republican National Committee, and I'm going to support them in a lawsuit to get an audit of every penny, soft and hard, to see exactly where the money went in the last presidential election.
Yeah, I mean, you've been around the RNC for 50 years. I don't think it's an overstatement. It's not. Has it ever been less effective, do you think, than it is
Well,
now?
it didn't matter in the past. Here's why. Every time you nominated a candidate for president, the RNC became a backwater. You never ran your campaign through the Republican National Committee, mostly because there were more Democrats than Republicans. So you had the presidential candidate's campaign, and then you had the party committee. That's why the break-in in the Watergate never made any sense. There would be nothing at the DNC worth knowing during the presidential campaign.
Right.
It was all over at George McGovern's headquarters. That's where the action was.
Of course.
So Donald Trump is the first president in history in the Republican Party who runs his reelection, essentially cedes control of his presidential reelection campaign to the Republican National Committee. Why would you ever do that? Those people put the party first and their own job in the party first instead of putting your presidential candidacy first. It's never been done, ever. But we did it, and I think it was one of the reasons why the election was as muddled as it was. The best
Whose idea was that?
I suspect that, well, first of all, it's recognized. Donald Trump's not a politician.
Right.
He doesn't know that that's the way it doesn't, he doesn't know that it doesn't work that way.
Yes.
No one's ever produced that option. And that your campaign should be over here and be completely independent, mainly because you don't want the Republican label. You have to attract Democrats, blue-collar, working-class, conservative Democrats. The reason that Trump wins and Mitt Romney doesn't and John McCain doesn't, if you just go study Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, is because he does better in those blue-collar Democratic areas, and he gets a few more percent of African-American votes in the cities. 2 points in Detroit is a big deal when you only carry Michigan by 10,000 votes.
Right.
So I don't understand the fundamental structure of the campaign was flawed. I still believe Trump won because the best thing about a Trump campaign is Trump. He's like a man working without a net. I mean, he's entertaining, and he's funny, and he's pugnacious. And when he hits the stump, he's pulling these enormous crowds. He's commanding media coverage that he couldn't normally get in the normal scheme of things. Trump is exciting. Politics is about being interesting.
Yes.
Richard Nixon once said the only thing worse in politics than being wrong is being boring. Donald Trump is never boring.
So that I just want to digress really quickly because I can't resist. You worked for the two most hated Republicans really ever, Nixon and Trump. You explained why Trump was so hated, I think correctly, by saying he couldn't be controlled. Why was Nixon so hated?
Because they thought he was going to be a Cold Warrior. They thought that he would keep us in Vietnam. They didn't foresee a strategic arms limitation with the Russians.
Yeah.
They didn't foresee the opening of the door to China. Nixon was a peacemaker. That's why they took him down. They took him down for many of the same reasons they wanted to take Trump down. I mean,
wait, so just to be clear, yeah, it's a great picture of you and Nixon. Just to be clear, Nixon's sin was not that he was for a war, but that he was against it.
Well, I mean, first of all, in the 1960 election, Nixon is shocked when John Kennedy comes at him, not from the left, but from the right.
Right.
The missile gap, Quemoy and Matsu, the two islands we're arguing with the Chinese over. You're not doing enough to remove Castro. Of course, Kennedy's already been briefed on the Bay of Pigs plan that's already in the works. Nixon can't say anything about that. Kennedy pounds Nixon. We need a defense buildup. Well, Eisenhower's opposed to a defense buildup. So Vice President Nixon can't be for one. Now, Nixon is ultimately, because of the murder of John Kennedy, the murder of Robert Kennedy, the murder of Dr. King, and the Vietnam War, the political seas part for the greatest comeback in American political history. But the Hawks believe they've nominated the ultimate hardliner. But Nixon's for détente. He doesn't want war with the Russians.
Right.
And when the talks over strategic arm limitations start to sputter, he announces he's going to China. Do you think that got the attention of the Russians? They have a common border. In fact, they hate each other more than they hate us. Or I should say, worried more about us. Let's remember, at the time Nixon recognizes China, there are more oxen than there are automobiles in the country.
Yes.
He has no way to see that the Bushes are going to give them most favored nation trading status and that they would sometimes rival this country economically, even though they have an autocratic system. He also has no way of seeing that they would ultimately use huge doses of capitalism to build their country.
So Nixon was hated because it sounds like he was not going to be controlled either.
Well, I think that the deep state of its day, I think Dwight Eisenhower called them the military-industrial complex, was unhappy about the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, the end of the Vietnam War, the outreach to China. It is indisputable that 4 of the Watergate burglars are still on the payroll of the Central Intelligence Agency, and they're reporting the whole thing to the agency. That's a fact. It's in my book, Nixon Secrets.
Yeah, because, I mean, those of us who grew up right in the immediate aftermath of Watergate, I kind of vaguely remember it on the television. The idea was that Nixon was like the worst human being who'd ever lived. I mean, he was really up there with Stalin. And then, you know, the decades passed and you look back and you think, well, maybe not the warmest person, but how was Nixon the worst president? He's probably not even close. In fact, he won the biggest landslide in American history in 1972. I think, I mean, you would know. But
yes, but also let's remember that he is always despised by liberal elites because he turns out to be correct about Alger Hiss being a communist spy. So once he nails Hiss as a spy, and by the way, after the Soviet Union falls and we get the KGB records, guess what? Alger Hiss was a spy. We now know it for a certainty.
Yes, we do.
So the media never gets over that. That is Nixon's anti-communism, which, by the way, serves him well for the rest of his political career. But that's the reason that the liberal elites hate him from the beginning.
But if the 1972 election is the largest landslide in the history of democracy, which it was, and then a year later he's being run out of office because the Washington Post, it is actually kind of a piddling little story.
Yes, but he is, like Trump, he's an outsider. He didn't go to Harvard or Yale.
But it does make you think like maybe this democracy thing isn't really
Well,
doesn't really matter how many votes you get.
Well, I would say this. The growing power of the media when you had no internet. So had you had the internet in 1972 and 3, Nixon would have survived. He was a fighter. He didn't want to go. But from what platform would he mount his counterattack?
Right.
He couldn't get a fair hearing anyplace. And consequently, a president was taken down. Now, if you go back and look at the crimes and you compare them to Barack Obama and
exactly.
Joe Biden, who used fabricated evidence to justify the politically motivated investigation for the purposes of bringing down a duly elected president. They used the full authority of the U.S. government and the capability of our intelligence agencies for strictly political purposes. That makes Watergate look like a third-rate burglary, I'd say.
Is that how you describe it?
Yeah.
But I think what you're saying is actually totally true and defensible, and it's a little bit shocking to realize. Okay, so before you go, I got to go through some of Stone's rules. Now, one of the reasons you are famous is not just because of your remarkable career and the Job-like suffering you've had to endure recently, but because you've distilled the accrued wisdom of the decades in a book called Stone's Rules.
Which has a phenomenal foreword, by the way, by Tucker Carlson.
You know, I wrote that foreword like so long ago, I don't even remember writing it.
It was so good I had to use it. But, look, I give Mike Smerconish at CNN enormous credit because he knew I'd written the book and I wasn't publishing the book. And I told him I had a foreword that you had written, and he said, you need to publish this. And he kept pushing me, and finally I published it. And of course, it is up there with Sun Tzu's The Art of War and Machiavelli's The Prince. It's the second greatest book ever written after the Bible, actually.
Well, let's prove that by reading a few of these for our viewers. Here's Rule 42. Let no attack go unanswered.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. In the political news cycle, in fact, Bill Clinton was better at this than anyone. You've got to return fire immediately. Saying nothing is a confirmation of the original attack on you. And those who say, well, you're only repeating the charge so more people will hear it, that's not the point. You might want to recap the charge, but then you fire back. Remember, the 3 roles: admit nothing, deny everything, launch counterattack.
Rule number 62, ponytails are for men under 30.
Yeah, you see a guy with a ponytail, it's the worst. I mean, I think it should be a federal offense, actually.
But why aren't more men aware of that?
Well, I think it's a bi-coastal thing. In other words, I think you see them in New York and you see them in L.A. You don't see them much in Omaha. You certainly don't see them in Tulsa. I just think it's a fashion faux pas or a style faux pas.
Rule number 103, never ride in a white limousine.
Yeah, because they're invariably full of strippers. In other words, if you're in a white limousine, that's what the strip club sends to go get you with a couple bottles of bubbly in the back. So if you want to look like a pimp, or if you're on your way to a gentleman's club, a white limousine. I actually tell candidates never ride in a limousine at all, of any color, because, of course, it makes you look like an elite. You want to be with the American people.
For sure. And here's one that's going to lead to my last question to you, which is very wise. Rule 66, never turn down a major party nomination.
Yeah, because you never know what will happen. Christy Todd Whitman, not my favorite politician.
I agree.
But she takes a nomination against Bill Bradley, which everyone knows is hopeless. Bill Bradley's a basketball legend. He's a U.S. Senator from New Jersey. But then Jim Florio, the Democrat governor, triples the state income tax. There's a voter uprising. She comes within points of beating Bill Bradley. That leads to the gubernatorial nomination the next year in which she becomes the governor. Right. So this is actually one that I cribbed from Nixon. Nixon in 1964 knew that Goldwater was going down in flames, So Romney, Rockefeller, Scranton, they all head for the tall grass. They're gone. They won't endorse Goldwater. They won't campaign for him. Richard Nixon made more speeches for Barry Goldwater than Goldwater made for himself. Why? Because he knows there's another presidential election in 4 years. And he knows that nomination is valuable. So in 1968, Bill Buckley, John Tower, Barry Goldwater, Strom Thurmond, all the most important conservatives are already committed to Richard Nixon by the time Ronald Reagan decides maybe he'd like to run for president in 1968.
Where was Reagan on Goldwater?
Goldwater resented Reagan in a really strange way. Reagan revered Goldwater. Goldwater resented Reagan. It was a very odd relationship. Beyond that, I think both in the case of Goldwater and more precisely in the case of Nixon, they could never understand how Reagan made it all look so effortless.
Yeah.
So they were always calculating, particularly Nixon, calculating, planning the odds, positioning themselves. Whereas Reagan seemed to have no regard for the minor political details, but he had this big picture view of things and how they worked, and he made it all look so effortless. Remember, Nixon lost the 1962 governorship to Pat Brown. Reagan came back 4 years later and beat Pat Brown, and then, of course, went on to be president. So I think in this particular case, Reagan made it look so good, was so good at what he did, was such a big picture guy, reminds me very much of Donald Trump. Reagan was into the entertainment of it, the performance.
Yes.
Very much like Trump.
Well, so in that, I mean, this is the obvious segue. So never turned down a major party nomination. Feels like Trump could get the nomination of the Republican Party once again.
He most certainly could. I mean, look, it is now his party. It has changed at the grassroots. We're not going back to be the party of the feckless, gutless, weak-kneed, lily-livered, white wine swilling, country club belonging Bush Republicans. That's never going to happen. The party has changed fundamentally at the grassroots. We are the party of America first. We're the party of working Americans. That's not going to change no matter what Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell do. So they're going to suck up money talking about immigration, talking about COVID, talking about all of these issues, but they're not really ever going to do anything about it.
I've noticed. Yeah.
But at the grassroots of the party, where the energy is, where the primary victories will be, this is still Donald Trump's party. He can command this nomination if he wants to, and nobody can stop him.
So I asked you, I'll just be honest, asked you before we went on the air, do you think he'll run again? And you said you weren't sure, that it would depend on what happens in the midterms.
Sure, look, you'd be foolish to make a decision today. He doesn't need to decide until immediately after the 2022 elections. And whether we have a fair, honest, transparent, uncontested set of elections would be a major factor in my decision making if I had to decide to whether to run. I think he would like to run. I think that he, as a patriot, he hates seeing what's happening to the country. Look at gas prices. Look at our humiliation in Afghanistan, where the instinct is correct to withdraw our troops.
For sure.
But you cover your withdrawal with all this fancy technology and these drones that you paid for. We didn't do that, and we left $8 billion worth of equipment behind. In the military's own manuals, remove the material and the weapons before you remove the troops.
Of course.
So I think it really hurts the president to see what's happened to our country. And I think that would be his motivation to run again if he runs. He doesn't need to run to get his name ID up. He doesn't need to run because he wants a big fancy house. He's already got that. He doesn't need to run because he wants a big fancy airplane. He's got the greatest plane in the world. No, if he runs again, it's because he loves America.
Well, last time he ran and won, the people in charge of every institution in American life went completely crazy. They're now saying that if he were to run again, that would be an offense against democracy, a guy running in a democratic system. What do you think the response would be if Trump ran again?
Panic, absolute panic, because I believe that he's beaten them twice, and they still can't get over 2016. They're still trying to revive Russian collusion. I mean, Trump wins again, who knows? Adam Schiff might kill himself. I mean, they can't handle it because they don't understand the connection that he has with regular Americans. They are so elite, they don't understand, for example, that The Apprentice is a major factor in the rise of Trump as a political figure.
Yeah.
Well, that's reality TV. No, to the average American, television is television. The news and entertainment, it's seamless. It's all the same.
Yeah.
And on The Apprentice, what do they see? He's perfectly lit. He's in command. He looks great. He's in the high back chair. he looks like the president they wish they had. So I think that they will go out of their minds. But the next nominee of the Republican Party, which will be Donald Trump if he wants, will be an outsider. We're not going back to the career politicians. We're not going back to the country club.
If he ran again, would you work for him?
I would certainly support him. I'm not, he hasn't asked me to work for him, so I can't answer that question. But there's no question he's my first, second, and third choice for the nomination. If he doesn't run, I'll support another outsider. But I'll tell you who I'm not for. I'm not for Mike Pompeo.
Why is that?
Well, first of all, he's the one who says that Julian Assange is a state actor working for a foreign government. He lays the entire groundwork for the Russian collusion hoax. He's also behind the efforts to assassinate Assange at the embassy, and he's behind the current effort to extradite Assange. For him to put himself forward as an America First Republican when it comes to foreign policy is a joke. He also went to Yale. I don't think anybody who was elected who went to Yale should be president.
You can see why, watching the persecution of Roger Stone, you think, just as an observer, they're taking the one interesting, really smart guy in all of Republican politics and trying to throw him in jail. It was an outrage. Even if I didn't like you personally, which obviously I do, but even if I didn't, I would be opposed to it. Roger Stone, thank you so much for spending all this time with us today.
Thank you, Tucker, and God bless you.
God bless. Thank you. Roger Stone, ladies and gentlemen. Tucker Carlson today is the name of the show. New episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday here on Fox Nation. We'll see you every weeknight, 8 p.m. on the Fox News Channel.